So I have the honor of introducing my former boss and good friend, Attorney General Eric Holder, who we're so delighted is with us today. I'm going to start, though, by bringing greetings from someone who is quite interested in this topic. And he writes to the Brennan Center, "I send greetings to all those participating in a conversation on automatic voter registration. The success of the American experiment in self-government relies on engaging all of our citizens in the work of building a better politics. This includes ensuring every person can exercise their right to vote, no matter who they cast their ballot for. When we vote, our government is more reflective of who we are as a people, and our nation is better off. That is why I join you in supporting steps such as automatic voter registration for those applying to get a driver's license. Actions like this not only make it easier for people to make their voices heard, but they also modernize our voting system in the 21st century, helping build a more fair and inclusive democracy for all. So as you come together to enable more of our citizens to fulfill our most vital civic responsibility, I wish you all the best. Barack Obama." So the key is to speak after Barack Obama in writing and before Attorney General Holder in person. So it is humbling to introduce one of the great attorney generals in our history, and it's tempting to do so by rattling off all of his accomplishments, the hundreds of terrorism convictions and the record financial fraud cases, standing up for LGBT equality and restoring what he calls the conscience of the department, the Civil Rights Division, to its rightful place in the department. But I was excited to do this today because it gives me an opportunity to talk about a part of the Attorney General's legacy that, in my opinion, he doesn't get enough credit for, and that is his fierce devotion to protecting voting rights in the face of new obstacles and challenges to the franchise. My last full year in the Obama administration, and I say it like that to remind the Attorney General that I succeeded in leaving before he did. The Supreme Court issued its decision in Shelby County, gutting Section 5, one of the core protections, the heart, really, of the Voting Rights Act. Now, the Attorney General was protecting voting rights through his stewardship of the department long before that decision, whether ensuring that motor voter laws were properly administered and enforced, to standing up for military voters overseas or language minorities at home. But in one of the darkest hours for the right to vote in the last half century, which was the aftermath of that decision, I saw how determined the Attorney General was to make one thing very clear to the American people, and that is that we were not going back. So how did he do this? What did he do? Well, within minutes of the decision being issued, the Attorney General was pretty much on every television network, making very clear his intention to shift resources to one of the most important remaining provisions of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, and his commitment to fully utilizing other parts of that law, such as its monitoring and observation provisions. And it didn't take long for him to prove that he meant it, that this was more than just a policy statement, whether it's filing Section 2 challenges to some of the most restrictive voter ID laws we've seen in quite some time in Texas or North Carolina, to directing his department to fight back on cutbacks to early voting. But for the Attorney General, protecting the right to vote was never simply a backwards-looking exercise or one that really should just center around preserving some of the crown jewels in our civil rights laws like the VRA. He understood that our system of voting really needed a 21st century update, that in a country like ours that invented the iPhone and the Facebook, we couldn't really justify 5-hour-long lines for people to vote, or people not being able to vote because they missed a registration deadline or were confused after a move. He understood that politicians shouldn't be picking voters, that it should be the other way around, and that just because poll taxes are outlawed, that doesn't mean that state legislatures and officials can't come up with new ways to restrict the franchise. And so on almost every single occasion that I heard the Attorney General speak about voting rights, whether in Congress or in forums like this one, he called for a modern update to our system, and it really rested on 3 pillars for him. Ending deceptive practices, redistricting reform, and as relevant today, automatic voter registration. So I'm not going to preempt his remarks, but one thing that I always appreciated about his calls in this area was his ability to both tout our ability to use modern technology advances and data analytics to reform our system, while also pushing back on the common excuse to do nothing, which is the specter of voter fraud, and no one's better to do that than a former prosecutor. So we're delighted to have him with us today. We could not have invited a better speaker for this event. So with that, Mr. Attorney General.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to say, it's a pleasure to be here, and I was a little worried when I heard that Danielle was introducing me. We go a long way back, and she knows where a lot of things are buried, and so that introduction could have gone any number of ways. But thank you so much, Danielle, for those kind words. Today, I would like to discuss with you an issue that I believe threatens the integrity of this great nation and really puts in peril the future welfare of our country. I'd also like to suggest some ways in which we might make real for the people of the United States the promise of our democracy. Now, 50 years after the passage of perhaps the most significant civil rights legislation in our nation's history, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the most basic of American rights, the right to vote, is under siege. Now, as President Johnson said when he signed the Voting Rights Act, quote, "The right to vote is the basic right, without which all others are meaningless," unquote. At a time when we should be expanding opportunities to cast a ballot, there is a movement in America that attempts to make it more difficult, abetted by a wrongly decided, factually inaccurate, and disconnected Supreme Court decision that unfortunately bears my name. And that really, really pisses me off. So whenever you're talking about that case, don't ever say Shelby County versus Holder. Just say Shelby County, you know? Make like it doesn't exist, that part. Well, make like the decision doesn't exist. Well, we have to deal with that. Merrick Garland, I hope when he is confirmed, will have some kind of, we'll set some kind of precedent here, and we will go back and take a decision and change the name. It's one of my requirements for his confirmation. But abetted by that decision, I think too many in this country are trying too hard to make it too difficult for the people to express their views. Now, let me start with a basic statement upon which I think everybody can agree, left, right, conservative, progressive. Every person attempting to vote should have to show that he or she is who they claim to be. Too many today forget that this has always been the case, and that in the past, our fellow citizens were allowed to demonstrate that in many credible ways. Now, let me say that again. There has always been a component of identifying yourself before you could cast a ballot. It's only very recently that in some states, they have become overly prescriptive and unfairly restrictive in enumerating what is sufficient proof. Now, it has only been in the very recent past and in certain states with certain legislatures and certain governors that this more restrictive prescribed approach has been mandated. And the question is why? Well, the usual justification is to ensure the integrity of the electoral system by preventing voter fraud. Well, given the nature of the fraud that is to be eliminated, the new restrictions must, I assume, be designed to prevent in-person false identification voting. Now, although there is no statistical proof that there is, in fact, an issue about which the nation should be concerned, the vote fraud mantra is said so often, it's said almost robotically, that some people have unthinkingly begun to believe that the issue is, in fact, real. But studies have shown that the actual instance of in-person voter fraud is extremely, extremely rare. And this is very logical. The penalties associated with voter fraud, usually felonies, far outweigh the impact that an individual or even a group of people might affect. To truly impact an election would probably require substantial numbers of people somehow holding themselves out as voters that, in fact, they are not, which would increase almost exponentially the potential exposure of the scheme. No such widespread schemes have been detected. The Brennan Center has stated, and I quote again, "It is more likely that an individual will be struck by lightning and that he will impersonate another person at the polls," unquote. Now, I think that you should have used perhaps a Powerball analogy there, but struck by lightning gives you a sense of how rare this is. One expert found, as tried to look at all the cases, found 31 cases out of more than 1 billion votes cast in the United States from 2000 to 2014. 31 out of 1 billion over the course of 14 years. People of good faith, people grounded in the facts, really have to ask, where is the problem? And have to conclude that there simply isn't a consequential one, and that the restrictive voting laws enacted to combat the next to non-existent problem with their serious negative collateral consequences are in fact not needed. Instead of ensuring the integrity of the voting process, they actually do the opposite by keeping certain groups of people away from the polls. Now, if there's not a fact-based voter impersonation problem, what then could be the basis for the photo identification push? Well, sadly, one party has decided to lash itself to short-term political expediency and put itself on the wrong side of history. And history will be harsh in its assessment of this effort. In a 2007 article, the Houston Chronicle quoted the political director of the Texas Republican Party and stated, "Among Republicans, it is an article of religious faith that voter fraud is causing us to lose elections," he said. The article goes on to say, he doesn't agree with that, but does believe that requiring photo IDs could cause enough of a drop-off in legitimate Democratic voting to add 3% to Republican votes, unquote. In Pennsylvania, in the last presidential election in 2012, the Republican State House Majority Leader listed a few partisan issues that were going to help Mitt Romney carry the state. After listing guns and abortion, he said, and again I quote, "Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania, done," unquote. A federal court in Washington, D.C., in throwing out a Texas Republican-supported voter identification law, stated that it would impose, and again I quote, "strict, unforgiving burdens on the poor," unquote. And remember, under that Texas state law, a university ID was found not to be adequate proof, but a state-issued concealed weapons permit was. Okay. Finally, in Wisconsin last year, a chief of staff to a leading Republican state senator resigned after attending a party caucus in which he said some legislators were, and I'm quoting his words now, literally giddy over the effect of state voter ID laws on minorities and college students. So let's be frank. Faced with demographic changes that they perceive go against them, and saddled with a governing philosophy at odds with an evolving nation, some Republicans have decided that if you can't beat them, change the rules. Make it more difficult for those individuals least likely to support Republican candidates to vote. This is done with the knowledge that by simply depressing the vote of certain groups, not even winning the majority of votes in these groups, elections can in fact be affected. A 2014 study by the GAO found that the more restrictive voter ID laws decreased the votes of young people, minorities, and the poor in Kansas and Tennessee in 2012. A recent study conducted by the University of California, San Diego, after controlling for a variety of factors, a very scientific study, concluded that these new laws disproportionately affected Democratic voters. The study found that Democratic turnout dropped about 7% where strict photo ID laws were in place. Latino turnout decreased by 10%, and there was an increase in the participation gap between whites and people of color. If one were to try to find what vote fraud is, that is voter fraud. Now, the nation's attentions and laws should not be focused on these phantom illegal voters. The Census Bureau reported that in 2008 presidential election, of the 75 million adult citizens who did not vote, 60 million were not registered. and therefore not eligible to cast a ballot. That is one of the places where I think we should focus our efforts. In a speech I gave in 2011 at the LBJ Library, I called for the automatic registration of all eligible citizens. And the logic of the arguments I made then, I believe, is still sound. The ability to vote is a right. It is not a privilege. Under our current system, many voters must follow needlessly complex and cumbersome voter registration rules. And before and after every election season, state and local officials have to manually process a crush of new applications, most of them handwritten, leaving the system riddled with errors and too often creating chaos at the polls. The Pew Center estimates that 1 in 8 voter registrations in the United States is invalid or significantly inaccurate. Modern technology provides, I believe, a straightforward fix for these problems if we have the political will to bring our election systems into the 21st century. Government can and should automatically register citizens to vote by compiling from existing databases a list of all eligible residents in each jurisdiction. And several states have taken steps in that direction. Oregon implemented an automatic registration procedure at its DMV in January and has already seen a nearly 4-fold increase in registrants. California, Vermont, and West Virginia have passed similar laws, and other states are leaning in that direction as well. It is estimated that if implemented at DMVs, but also at other key government agencies, not just DMVs, other key government agencies, these needed reforms could add 50 million eligible voters to the rolls, save money, and increase accuracy in the records necessary to the system. We must also address the fact that although 1 in 9 Americans moves every year, their voter registration does not move with them. Many would-be voters don't realize this until after they've missed the deadline for registering in their new location, which can fall a full month or even more before Election Day. Election officials, I believe, should work together to establish a program of permanent portable registration so that voters can vote at their new polling place on Election Day. But until that happens, I think we should implement fail-safe procedures to correct voter roll errors and omissions by allowing every voter to cast a regular, non-provisional ballot on Election Day. Now, several states have already taken this step, and it's shown to increase turnout by at least 3 to 5 percentage points. These modernization efforts would not only improve the integrity of our elections, they would also save precious taxpayer dollars. Now, despite these benefits, there are always going to be those who say that easing registration hurdles and Election Day processes will only lead to voter fraud. Well, let me be clear. Voter fraud, to the extent that it actually exists, is not acceptable, and it should not be tolerated. But as I learned early in my career as a prosecutor in the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section, where I actually investigated and prosecuted real voting fraud cases, making voter registration and voting easier are simply not likely by themselves to make our elections more susceptible to fraud. Indeed, those on all sides of this debate have essentially acknowledged that in-person voting fraud is uncommon. We have to be honest about this, and we must recognize that our ability to ensure the strength and the integrity of our election systems and to advance the reforms necessary to achieve this depends on whether the American people are informed, engaged, and willing to demand fact-based contentions and common-sense solutions and regulations that make voting more accessible. Now, politicians may not readily and willingly alter the very systems under which they were elected, even though 80% of Republicans oppose the Citizens United decision, and 2/3 of voters support strengthening voter protections and the restoring of the Voting Rights Act. Only we, the people, can bring about a meaningful change and alter current discriminatory trends. Now, in this regard, I really want to commend the Brennan Center for its leadership on these issues. The center first proposed automatic voter registration in 2007 and has done much since then to advance the policy and other voting enhancements through extensive research and public education. So, speak out. Raise awareness about what is at stake. Call on the political party most responsible to resist the temptation to suppress certain votes in the hope of attaining electoral success, and instead work to achieve this success by appealing to more voters. What do they fear? The very people who they claim they want to represent, and urge policymakers at every level to reevaluate our electoral systems and to reform them in ways that encourage, not limit, participation. Insist that they make it easier to register and easier to vote. And ask them, why is voting tied to a single Tuesday in November? Work to expand voting days and hours so that many of our fellow citizens need not choose between casting a ballot and keeping their jobs. Increase, not decrease, as was disastrously done in Arizona recently, the number of polling places where our fellow citizens can truly participate in our democracy. Today we cannot and we must not take the right to vote for granted, nor can we shirk the sacred responsibility that falls upon our shoulders. Throughout his presidency, Lyndon Johnson, who made the promise of the 1965 Voting Rights Act real, he frequently pointed out, and again I want to quote, America was the first nation in the history of the world to be founded with a purpose, to right wrong and to do justice, unquote. Well, over the last 2 centuries, the fulfillment of this purpose has taken many forms: acts of protest and compassion, declarations of war and peace, and a range of efforts to make certain that, as another great president said, government of and by and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Today there are competing visions about how our government should move forward. We are a noisy nation, and that's a good thing. That's what the democratic process is all about: creating space for thoughtful debate, creating opportunities for citizens to voice their opinions, and ultimately letting the people chart their own course. Our nation has worked and even fought to help people around the world establish such a process. Here at home, honoring our democracy demands that we remove any and all barriers to voting, a goal that all American citizens of all political backgrounds must share. Now, despite so many decades of struggle, sacrifice, and of achievement, we must remain ever vigilant in safeguarding our most basic and important right. Too many recent actions, I believe, are simply shameful and have the potential to reverse the progress that defines us and has made this nation exceptional, as well as an example for all the world. We must be true to the arc of America's history, which compels us to be more inclusive with regard to the franchise. And we must never forget the purpose that more than 2 centuries ago inspired our nation's founding and now must guide us forward. So let us act with optimism and without delay. Let us rise to the challenges and overcome the divisions and also the fallacies of our time. Let us signal to the world that in America today, the pursuit of a more perfect union lives on. Now is not the time to retreat in the face of a partisan assault on the most basic of American rights. The battle to ensure the voting rights of all Americans is, I believe, a defining one. This is not only a legal issue, it is also a moral imperative. If we are to be the nation that we claim to be, we must challenge in every way possible those who would undermine our democracy and who have lost faith with the covenant between government and the people. The right to vote is not only the cornerstone of our system of government, it is the lifeblood of our democracy. I am confident that with a focused citizenry and with leaders like those in the room today, this struggle for right will be won. If we ought to remain true to those who sacrificed and died to ensure the right to vote, we must simply not fail. Thank you very much.
Please join me in saying to Attorney General Holder, thank you for your passion, thank you for your strong leadership, thank you for staying in the fight, and thank you for reminding us that what we're talking about here today. Some of us get very excited about opting in and opting out and some of the technical aspects of this. But this is a part of the greatest of American stories around that most central of American values. We are the world's oldest democracy. We should be the world's best democracy. And thank you for what you said and what you do to make that happen. Today, as the Attorney General reminds us, that right to vote requires a fight to vote that every one of you is part of. So we want to thank the Attorney General. We want to thank Secretary of State Alex Padilla, the tremendous and thoughtful speakers on the previous panel. And I want to thank all of you for being here. The public portion of this day is concluding. We hope we go out to the world with energy, with enthusiasm. There will be an afternoon strategy session for some of the folks from around the country. Those who are staying for that will be having lunch. Again, thank you, Mr. Attorney General, and thank you to my colleagues at the Brennan Center and to all of you.